Welcome back, dear listener. Or if this is your first time by the fire, welcome. You've arrived at the quiet hour of the nighttime historian, a place where forgotten cities still breathe beneath earth and ash, where the ruins do not weep but remember, and where stories rise not with thunder but with dust and moonlight, echoing from temples long buried and scripts long silent. Tonight, we walk among the bones of civilizations that left no last word, not lost in battle nor swallowed by fire, but faded, as if history itself turned the page too soon. These were peoples who carved beauty into clay and meaning into stone, who spoke in languages we no longer understand, and vanished not with a scream, but with a whisper. We will drift through 3 ancient worlds, each once mighty, each now quiet. First to the banks of a river that no longer flows as it once did, where the Indus Valley cities stood, precise and peaceful, governed not by kings but by rhythm and order. A civilization with no palace, no war, and no known farewell. Then across the sea to Crete, to the realm of the Minoans, whose frescoes danced and whose temples breathed with open air. Their world shimmered with grace and balance, until the earth shook, the seas rose, and the labyrinth was left behind. And finally, to the highlands of Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire once rode with chariots and storm gods, ruling through tablets and treaties before silence settled on their citadels, and no final hand recorded their fall. This is not the tale of one kingdom, but of many, and of the quiet that comes after, a silence shaped like memory, a disappearance that still leaves footprints, a history that history itself does not remember. Before we begin tonight's journey, I would ask you kindly to leave a comment and share where you're listening from, whether it's a quiet attic beneath the rain, a house by the sea where only the wind speaks, or a bed where the world finally slows. It's a quiet joy to know who keeps this company with us, and if these stories linger with you, if they make the silence feel less empty, you're always welcome to return and subscribe. But only if your heart finds something true in these forgotten places. So now, let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day slide into the dark. Imagine the scent of wet earth where rivers once flowed, the glow of a clay lamp flickering in a shrine without a name, the hush of a scribe's breath as they press meaning into soft, unbaked tablets. Picture thresholds worn smooth by generations, the murmur of wind across a palace with no throne, the echo of gods whose names were never written down. Let your mind drift not toward answers, but toward questions. Questions buried in cities that no longer speak, in a script that will not explain, in temples shaped by memory rather than monument. Let yourself fall gently into the unknown, into the soft mystery of the Bronze Age, and into the stories that wait, not to be solved, but to be remembered. Beneath the skin of the world we walk, there are stories pressed deep into the soil, fainter stories than the kinds that are etched into marble or carried in crowns, ones told in fractured stones, in forgotten alignments of walls, in clay impressions shaped by hands that never signed their names, stories that once rang with voices and laughter, with ritual and rhythm, and now linger only as traces, smudges, outlines where something vast used to live. These are not tales of conquest or glory. There are no conclusive dates, no last stands, no triumphant return, only the quiet certainty that something was, and then gradually, it was not. In some places, the buildings remain, but not the builders. In others, the earth has drawn a veil over everything. Yet still, in the gaps, we find patterns,
a shard of painted pottery here, a sealed doorway buried in sand, a language no one living has ever spoken aloud. Some civilizations are remembered because they wanted to be. They carved their victories in stone. They filled their tombs with declarations. They demanded to be seen. But others, like those we visit tonight, did not leave us such certainties. They vanished differently, not erased, but receding, like a tide that forgets to return. This will not be a history of names and dates, but of questions, of unsolved mysteries from an age now known only in fragments. The Bronze Age, once vibrant with city lights and sacred fires, now lies scattered across the map like a dream half remembered. These were the first great civilizations, and some of the first to fall into silence. We do not know precisely why, but their echoes remain. We do not come to solve these absences. We come to walk beside them, to lean down and listen, not for answers, but for the faint shapes of memory that still breathe under dust. What does it mean to live in balance so fully that you leave no monument to yourself? What does it mean to disappear, not in collapse, but in quiet departure? What remains when a people no longer do? Tonight we walk the edge of those questions, through valleys where the rivers changed course, along palaces that once opened to the sky, among empires whose final chapter was never written. And if we are gentle, if we listen carefully, we may hear something still moving beneath the silence. Where the Himalayas sink into the northern plains, where their white teeth melt into soil and silence, the rivers begin, not with thunder, but with a whisper. A slow descent, pulled by time, carving valleys out of memory. The water glides through gorges and gullies, gathering silt, stirring old stone. It spreads like a braid undone, unspooling into fingers of fertile mud. This is where it begins, not just a river, but a wound, long and sinuous, drawn across the body of the land. In ages before maps, before the word India, before even the Vedas found voice in flame, there was the river, not just one but many, Sarasvati, Sutlej, Gaga, Indus, names we give now to the same lifeblood. But back then, there were no names, only sound and motion, the curve of water, the call of birds, the hush of reeds. These rivers didn't just nourish the land, they organized it. Each flood left stories behind, layers of silt, of forgotten fire pits, of footprints that hardened into permanence beneath clay roofs long gone. They called to wanderers like slow drums in the earth. Come, settle, stay a while. And they came. We don't know from where, not exactly. The people who first knelt in the river's silt did not announce themselves with conquest or monuments. They brought no kings, no gods with spears. They came with baskets, with fish hooks, with painted jars. They built in silence, mud walls, reed roofs, a hearth to hold fire through the night. They watched the rains and read the wind. They traded beads before they built walls. They marked seasons by the stars and planted barley in the flood's retreat. And somewhere, quietly, cooperatively, they began to build something vast. But before the cities, there was the fog, a time half seen. The centuries before Harappa, before Mohenjo-Daro, before Lothal, Kalibangan, Dolavira, the ghost centuries. We find their traces in scattered shards, in buried hearths, in bones of cattle and goats left curled beside spindle whorls and broken bowls. There was no empire then, no name for the people who would one day shape a civilization larger than Egypt or Sumer. They were families, clans, settlements of light and ash. Yet even then, something stirred in the way they placed their stones, the way their wells were dug with symmetry, the way their tools followed proportion. They were not just surviving, they were preparing. The river saw it all and said nothing. It carried their reflections in its surface, distorted by dragonflies and drifting pollen. It swallowed their ashes. It listened as children laughed across reed beds, as dogs barked at nothing in the twilight. It watched them dig their first granaries. It watched them count and measure and align. And when they began to build cities, real cities, with straight roads and drains, with citadels and storage rooms and long streets made for carts, they did so without the usual sounds of civilization. No epic wars, no coronation of kings, no statues with conquerors on horseback, just bricks, one after another, sun-dried and uniform, placed with eerie consistency across hundreds of miles. The Indus. That's what we call it now. But for them it was something else. A presence, a rhythm, maybe even a god. It's said the Sarasvati was once mighty here too, now a ghost river, remembered in Vedic hymns and dry riverbeds alike. Perhaps they were twin spirits, Indus and Sarasvati, carving space for humanity to gather. The land between them bloomed with possibilities, and 1,000 cities followed. And yet, we don't hear their voices. We find their houses, 2 stories high, some with inner courtyards. We find their toys, carved monkeys, clay carts. We find their needles, their dice, their combs, but not their words. They wrote yes, on seals, on ivory, on copper. They left behind a script, one that curves and twists and stamps with authority. But no one has read it, not after centuries of trying. The meaning of the Indus script remains locked behind lines we can see, but cannot understand. A silence in plain view. What kind of people build a world without statues of their rulers, without tombs to glorify their dead, without swords or shields or glorified battles in art? What kind of people place such faith in order, in symmetry, and leave behind no song, no epic, no boast? They built with baked brick and precision. They aligned their cities to cardinal directions. They crafted jewelry from carnelian and gold. They traded as far as Mesopotamia. They created, and they endured. And then, they stopped. The cities weren't destroyed. They were released. Like a held breath finally exhaled. One by one they were abandoned. Slowly, quietly. No walls torn down. No fires. No signs of conquest. Just the soft closing of doors that no longer needed to be locked. And for thousands of years, no one knew they had existed. Their names, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi, were lost beneath dust and farmland. The river changed its course. The jungle crept in. Earth covered them like a shroud. Until, one day in the 19th century, railway workers uncovered a brick, too perfectly shaped, too old to belong, and the past began to stir again. But even now the Indus Valley holds its breath. We uncover their homes, but not their voices. We find their streets, but not their songs. The clay still bears their fingerprints, but their faces are lost. The fog that preceded their rise has returned to cover their fall. Did they lose faith in their river? Did the floods cease? Did the monsoon change course? Did their gods fall silent? Did the silence begin from within, a spiritual stillness, a collapse of meaning? Answers probably lost to history. But we begin here, where the waters once ran thick with silt and prayer, where the cities once gleamed in the morning sun, and where the only sound now is the wind over baked earth and the soft hush of the archaeologist's brush. This is not the story of a fallen empire. It is the echo of a presence that never spoke, and yet once shaped half a continent. Let us walk the dry streets, where no one fled and no one returned. The streets run straight, not like paths worn down by feet, but like thoughts laid down in brick. There is no randomness here. The city moves by measure. Its walls follow lines invisible to the eye but felt in the feet, as if the land had once been ruled not by a king, but by a geometry that all obeyed. Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira. Cities of dust now, but in their time, they breathed in order and exhaled calm. There were no citadels that crowned their heights in splendor, no sculptures of rulers gesturing skyward, no war memorials, no trophies, no thunder. And yet, they worked, they moved, and lived with such precision that even now, we struggle to comprehend the quiet logic that guided them. Each brick was made to the same ratio, length, width, height, not as an afterthought but as a law. Fired in kilns that left no soot behind, they stacked into houses, platforms, towers. The cities were not haphazard masses but careful arrangements. Streets intersected at right angles, lanes narrowed with intention. Buildings leaned inward in harmony with the monsoon winds. There were drains running beneath the roads, not as accidents but as arteries. Water moved with as much care as language in a sacred chant. And the wells, dozens of them, hundreds, deep, circular, lined with perfect rings of brick, reaching down into the dark, as if in search of something deeper than water. Each household had one, or shared one. The cities rose with thirst in mind, and answered it with symmetry. In the heat, they reached inward, not upward, for relief. There were granaries too, raised platforms of thick walls and air channels, engineered to hold grain against the heat, the damp, the rats. Not vaults of treasure, but of sustenance, designed not for hoarding, but for storing breath across seasons. They suggest a shared future, a belief that food was not just for today, but for tomorrow, even for those not yet born. Who planned this? Who whispered these measurements into clay and brick? There are no tablets describing city laws, no inscriptions boasting of architects or kings. But there is a plan, a deep one, carried in silence, perhaps through generations, perhaps held only in memory and passed from hand to hand like a sacred shape. Each new city echoes the one before it, not as a copy, but as a chorus line echoing a distant note. And what cities they were! Mohenjo-daro alone stretched wide across the river plain, with an upper mound and a lower town, gridded streets, and great wells. But there are no palaces, no visible temples. The so-called Great Bath rests atop a plinth, watertight and deliberate, but even that is ambiguous. A place for ritual cleansing, perhaps, or something older still. The mystery deepens with every chamber. Each home had what it needed: rooms, courtyards, ovens, drains, privacy and practicality. Some even had second floors, but none towered arrogantly over others. The dwellings were modest, consistent. The city had no center, or rather, the whole was the center, a civic harmony instead of hierarchy. It was a place arranged not to control, but to accommodate. There are theories that a priestly class ruled softly, that trade guilds shared leadership, that each district governed itself. Or perhaps there were no rulers at all, only consensus, lineage, ancestral memory. Some argue that the true architecture of power here was invisible, not built in stone, but lived in ritual. That order itself was the god. And if so, these cities were temples of balance. They did not sprawl without care. They were placed with intent, near rivers, yet elevated, not just to avoid floods, but to receive them, to accept the flood's gift of silt and life, then let the waters go. They did not fight the river, they listened to it, and in listening, they endured. There is a kind of stillness in these cities, not of ruin, but of discipline, a hush by design, no grandeur, no declarations, and yet they held tens of thousands. They managed water, trade, food, health. They cleaned their streets. They aligned to the stars. They kept time without clocks, harmony without anthem, wealth without ostentation. And then they paused. Some of the streets began to erode. Some drains no longer led to exits. Some bricks were replaced with smaller ones, thinner, cheaper. The wells became shallower. The granaries stood less full. And though the cities continued for a time, the logic began to fade. But in this moment, before that soft unraveling, there was a time when clay and brick and purpose met, when the cities of the Indus moved not with command, but with coherence. It was a geometry of intention, not a pursuit of glory, but a quiet coherence. A way of living shaped not by the image of a king, but by the shape of the land, the breath of the monsoon, and the pulse of a people who built not to conquer, but to endure. When the sun rose over the baked plains of the Indus, it cast long shadows from low mud-brick walls, warmed the tops of flat-roofed homes, and flickered gold on still water caught in rooftop jars. The cities were waking, not with bells or commands, but with a slow murmur of steps, sweeping, voices, water drawn from deep within the earth. Smoke curled from small chimneys. Grain was ground between stones. The world stirred with a practiced grace, neither hurried nor idle, but measured by breath and fire. Children darted through narrow alleys where light pooled between rooftops. Bare feet slapped against warm stone. Their laughter mixed with the calls of merchants setting out painted carts, wheels creaking, oxen grunting, the rattle of copper and shell trinkets laid out like offerings. In shaded courtyards, grandmothers sat on mats, threading beads of carnelian and agate, each stone cooled by night, warmed by touch. Their fingers moved with rhythm learned from their mothers and their mothers before them, a rhythm not taught, but inherited. The beadmakers were artisans of patience. Tiny drills spun with cords of twisted fiber carved through gemstone and shell. Water dripped steadily to cool the work. Each hole, each curve, held the trace of human breath. These beads crossed mountains and deserts, ending up in distant lands we only guess at. Their makers may not have seen those shores, but their work traveled in silence, tucked into sacks of cloth, exchanged by hands that spoke in gesture more than word. In the workshops behind long courtyards, potters shaped vessels with wet hands and spinning wheels of smooth stone. The clay here was red and rich, pulled from riverbanks and mixed with straw. A good pot was symmetrical, not because it had to be, but because it pleased the eye, balanced the weight, felt right in the palm. Some were etched with animals or lines, not decorative, not quite script, but something that spoke through form. The fire that baked them was tended through the night, glowing like a secret hearth beneath the stars. Bathing was not rare or sacred. It was ordinary. A habit, not a rite. Brick-lined platforms near homes, paved floors sloped for draining. Cleanliness was part of the day, like bread or breath. Some homes had spaces that held water like cupped hands. The cities were not just built. They were maintained, repaired, loved in quiet ways. The market smelled of cardamom and warm milk, of sweat and pressed cloth. There was music sometimes, not orchestrated, not performed, but hummed, drummed softly on skin, or played on reed flutes for no audience but the air. Life here was not showy. Its richness lived in texture, not display. Spices were wrapped in leaf. Ink was ground on stone. Looms creaked. Goats passed through the city gates as if they knew the way. In the fields beyond the city walls, farmers moved with the river's memory. They planted with the monsoon in mind, following the soil's mood. Barley, wheat, lentils, coaxed from dust and sweat. They built channels and embankments, bent the land with care, not conquest. These were not fields of empire, but of kinship, not measured in acres, but in generations. There is a quiet complexity here that resists our categories. No lavish burials have been found, no hoards of royal gold, yet there is elegance in the uniformity, beauty in repetition. Bangles, weights, combs, ladles, all shaped with purpose. Life was not loud but full. Even the toys, clay carts, whistles, tiny animals with wheels, tell us they cared for the small joys, not just the sacred ones. And through it all, there was a current of ritual, not dramatic or dogmatic, but folded into daily tasks. A bowl placed just so, a fire lit with a whispered breath, shapes carved into thresholds, offerings left at corners, where streets met like old friends. It was not spectacle, but devotion, not doctrine, but memory worn into movement. The people who lived here may not have called themselves a civilization. They likely had no single name for what they were. Yet they moved together, across hundreds of miles, with a shared sense of order and comfort. From Gujarat to Punjab, from the dry steppes to the floodplains, they traded, married, argued, laughed, and lived, truly lived. There were no statues raised in their likeness, no poems etched in praise of their days, but they left the shapes of their lives pressed into earth and fired into clay. 1,000 small impressions, not of heroes, but of hands. And long after the ovens cooled and the market songs faded, the seals remained. Small, no larger than a palm, yet filled with images dense as myth, pressed into clay with careful pressure, fired, handed from one unknown life to another, found now in heaps of ruin, beneath courtyards and thresholds, in alleys where the scent of oil once lingered. Some were likely tools, markers of trade, signatures in clay. But others were more than function. They were echoes, locked doors, whispered invocations caught in fired stone. The images are intricate, lines scored with conviction, as if the hand that carved them already knew the form by heart. A figure seated, legs crossed, spine straight, eyes wide or perhaps closed, it is hard to tell. Horns curl from the crown. Arms fan outward in a pose that recalls meditation or command. Below him, tigers, elephants, buffalo, arranged like guardians. The animals face outward, but none attack. They watch. They wait. To some, he is the prototype of a god known much later, Pashupati, lord of beasts. Others call him Proto-Shiva, the yogi king, the ascetic dreamer who tames wild things with stillness. But there are no names on the seal, no prayers carved beside him, only geometry and gaze. Around him the sacred is suggested, not declared. Trees bloom with symmetrical precision. Bulls lower their heads, shaped with an artist's muscle memory. Sometimes a man stands between horns, not gored, not afraid, but absorbed. Perhaps a rite. perhaps a story, or perhaps something stranger, a cosmology not preserved in text, but in repetition, seal after seal, the same motifs, not copied, reinforced, recalled over and over, like a mantra pressed into the fabric of daily movement. And then there is the script, if it is a script, over 400 symbols arranged in no deciphered order. They appear on seals, on potsherds, on tablets the size of a thumb. Some repeat, others stand alone. There is rhythm but no translation, structure but no key. A language whose sounds have vanished, whose grammar is fossilized but mute. Some believe it was never meant to be read aloud, that it was visual, sacred, a symbolic code for initiates alone. Others think it was everyday, tallies, names, labels. Both might be true. The mystery lies not in the absence of meaning, but in its concealment. What we call mystery might have been obvious once, perhaps too obvious to explain, and perhaps that is what sanctity meant here, not the declaring of divine truth, but the keeping of it, the holding of knowledge like water in cupped hands, shown only in reflection. There were no temples in stone, no statues raised upon pedestals, but the seals, they travelled, from Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro, from Dolavira to Lothal. They crossed the length of this civilization like messages that never spoke, like a silence that was understood, not feared. In one image, a woman stands in profile beside a blooming tree. A symbol rises above her head, unclear. She is graceful, still. Some say she is a goddess, others a priestess. Some believe she is a figment of our own longing, to find meaning where none was left. Still, she endures, inked in reverse, etched into soapstone, surviving fire and earth and centuries of unknowing. Perhaps these were cosmologies encoded in gesture, the flick of a hand, the balance of line and edge. Perhaps the gods of the Indus were not jealous or wrathful, but woven into grain and weather, present in thresholds and wells, invoked not through spectacle, but through symmetry, a sacredness of proportion. It is difficult now to speak of belief without names, without sermons, without monuments, yet that may have been their strength. Their sacred was not built to be seen from afar, but felt up close, passed from hand to hand, worn, reused, like the wind that moves through a reed to make sound, but leaves the reed unchanged. What they worshipped we cannot say, but something moved them to carve, to repeat, to encode. Their devotion was not loud, yet it left a record more enduring than empires. It resides in stone and sign, in motifs that return like dreams, in a script whose silence is not empty but full of breath yet to be heard. Among the shards and ash where the Indus once ran thick with summer rain, in the silent strata of abandoned wells and granaries, there lie signs, carved into soapstone, etched in copper, pressed into moist clay before it was fired and forgotten. Not grand inscriptions or sweeping murals, but symbols, dozens at a time, meticulously spaced, scored with the intention of someone who believed in their clarity, someone who expected to be understood. There are less than 500 unique signs, and yet no two inscriptions are exactly the same. They span a continent's reach, from the baked bricks of Mohenjo-Daro to the salt-rimmed edges of Dolavira. Some are only a few characters long, others stretch in long, thin bands across tablets, miniature scrolls of unknown purpose. The signs themselves are elegant, curves and slashes, tridents and loops, fish that swim in lines, combs, stalks, diamonds. They feel like language, even if the ear cannot hear them. For more than a century, Scholars and dreamers alike have tried to listen. Linguists count the frequency of each glyph. Mathematicians model its structures. Computers trace patterns into code. And yet, nothing speaks. There is no Rosetta Stone. No buried tablet beside another in a known tongue. No bilingual king's boast carved into stone. Just these repeating signs, and our baffled reverence. The silence is not from neglect. It is active, as if the script recoils from interpretation. Every theory unravels under scrutiny. Was it a phonetic system, like early Sumerian cuneiform? Was it pictorial, like Egyptian hieroglyphs? Some claim it was a true language, Tamil's ancestor perhaps. Others say it was symbolic, sacred, not meant to record speech, but belief. Every time a key seems close, the lock shifts, and the gate remains sealed. Sometimes the symbols appear beside figures, bulls, birds, horned humans. Sometimes they stand alone. Never are they long. Never are they clarified by context. There are no names we can recognize, no mention of a king, a god, a place. Just symbols, as if the writers assumed that whoever saw them would already know the meaning. This is perhaps the strangest part, that it does not feel alien. It feels familiar. It looks like language. It breathes like language. And yet it remains just beyond the reach of our knowing, as though we've stumbled into a room where a conversation just ended, and all that's left are the footprints and the echo. The materials they chose were built for endurance: fired clay, carved stone, etchings that outlast ink, parchment, paper, breath. These were not idle doodles. Someone wanted this to last, to be carried, to be read. That no one now can is not the script's failure. It is ours. We cannot say if it recorded laws, or prayers, or trade. We don't know if it told stories, or simply named. We can only say that it was repeated, refined, respected. Some suggest the people of the Indus were not concerned with monuments, but memory, that the seal was their scripture, that each character was a syllable of something we have no mouth to say. Others believe it was a ritual code, passed among priests, marking cycles and ceremonies lost to time. A few imagine it as pure sound, like a musical notation, never meant to be spoken, only enacted. The seal pressed into wet clay before a rite. A reminder, perhaps, for what was about to unfold. And still others, the more radical, wonder if it was meant for us, for the future, for someone far beyond their world, when everything else had fallen quiet. A message not to contemporaries, but to ghosts. The comparison is inevitable. Cuneiform from Mesopotamia, deciphered. Egyptian hieroglyphs, unlocked with Rosetta. Linear B, cracked by stubborn minds. But this remains. Intact, legible, and yet impenetrable. Like a door that opens only for hands that no longer exist. The script that won't speak does not taunt us. It waits. Not in arrogance, but in patience. It is possible we are not yet ready, or that readiness is a myth, that some parts of the past do not echo. They remain still like standing water, reflecting only the face of the one who peers in. What is written may not be what we think of as writing at all. It may be a mirror. It may be a code of presence. It may be the remains of an entire worldview, not forgotten, but untranslated. The question is not whether we can understand it, but whether we belong to the same world that once did. And so the signs endure, on shards that once held oil, on tags that once sealed trade goods, on tiny tokens, dropped between floorboards or tucked in baskets, still waiting, still sharp, still closing their meaning like a fist around water. The words are there. The voice is not. The river, didn't vanish all at once. It shrank in retreat, like a thread pulled loose from a vast tapestry, drawn slowly back through time's hand. First it grew shallow, then brackish, then gone. Its absence left the ground pale and split. Clay cracked like old parchment. Wells dug deeper, then dried. What had once flowed with the rhythm of moons and monsoons now held only the shimmer of memory. And even that began to blur. There are no chronicles of protest, no records of siege or flight. The walls still stood. Streets remained intact. Granaries emptied by use, not by fire. The people did not leave in panic. They drifted. One home, then another. A market gone quiet. A kiln gone cold. The rhythm slowed until it dissolved altogether, like breath exhaled and not drawn again. The Indus dimmed. A kind of weariness settled into the bricks. Roofs fell inward. Floors buckled. The fine lattice of drains began to clog with dust. Moss grew in corners that once caught sunlight. Rain fell in strange seasons. Some say the monsoon had shifted. Others speak of distant quakes that pushed rivers from their beds, lifting the crust beneath them, bending the land into unfamiliar shapes. The gods were not blamed. They simply grew still. In old maps and sacred hymns, another river is named, Sarasvati, said to have once run mighty and full, its waters now swallowed by sand. Some believe it was real, that it coursed beside the Gagar-Hakra, feeding settlements older than history. If it flowed where they say it did, then the drying of Sarasvati would have unstitched the seam of the whole valley, a quiet undoing. No flood, no scream, just the earth forgetting its own path. What remained was strange. Cities left standing but empty, doorways without thresholds, markets without footprints, wells clean but dry, no signs of fire, no weapons, no bones in the street. As though the builders simply walked away, not defeated, but finished. One theory names trade as the first thread to fray. Goods had flowed across the sea to Mesopotamia, carnelian, lapis, etched ivory and cotton. But if the rivers curled back, so did the ships. Routes grew longer, less certain. Ports became sand, and the wide current of commerce that once moved like blood through the heart of this world slowed, then stopped. Another theory places blame in the sky. The monsoon, delicate and unpredictable, may have shifted course. Year by year, a little less rain, a little later than before, and the reservoirs, so carefully carved, began to dry. Fields went unplanted. Famine may have visited quietly, its footsteps muffled by the dust. Not sudden, but certain. The hardest part is that it happened slowly. Generation by generation, the world hollowed. A child grows up hearing stories of crowded lanes, but sees only emptiness. A grandmother remembers music, but no one plays anymore. The loss becomes ordinary, not a tragedy, but a season. What once stood tall becomes a background. What once bustled becomes forgotten. And yet, nothing was taken by force. There was no sack of cities, no conquering hand, only the unraveling of balance. The rhythm that once held everything together, water and brick, trade and ritual, became uneven. A wobble in the wheel, a hesitation, and from there the drift. Some believe the people did not vanish, they scattered, migrated east or north or into the forests. They took with them little of stone, much of seed. Maybe the rhythm returned elsewhere. Maybe it never did. They left behind no laments, no monuments of loss. Only cities that outlived their purpose. Vessels emptied of voice. Grass took root in courtyards. Vines gripped the edges of cisterns. The carvings on seals still bore their careful lines, but no one pressed them into clay again. Each abandoned place remained too intact to be a ruin, too quiet to be a shrine, just the hollow of something once vast. And this is what remains most haunting, the way everything stood waiting, as if it might begin again. But nothing did. This was not a fall, it was a dissolving. The bricks remained scattered in grids and fragments. The drains still slope, the wells still sink deep. But the thread that once bound it all, water, rhythm, gathering, had slipped. The body remained, but the pulse was gone. What began with rivers ended with dust. Long after the carts stopped rolling and the courtyards had folded into weeds, something lingered. Not the bustle nor the structure, nor even the sound of life, but a pattern. Faint, scattered, ghostly in its persistence. Designs once pressed into wet clay re-emerged centuries later in temples and textiles, faint as a breath caught in the weave. The horned beasts, the circle cross, the people leaf, each carried forward not by memory perhaps, but by momentum. As though a civilization did not collapse, but seeped slowly into the soil of what came after. There were no great tombs for the Harappans, no pyres on distant hills, no final proclamations scratched into stone. Their names, if they had any we could understand, did not survive. But something deeper than names did. Something in the way later generations built their shrines, painted their gods, poured their offerings into the ground. A rhythm faint but present, not inherited, absorbed. The Vedic hymns centuries later spoke of rivers long gone, of cities whose stones had no sound. They told of a Sarasvati, wide as the sky and lost beneath it. Did those singers remember Harappa? Or had they only heard of it in dust-thickened whispers? Some scholars argue that the rishis walked among ruins they could not name. Others say the connection is wishful, no link at all. Just proximity mistaken for lineage. And yet, the shapes return. The axis of worship remains the same. The figures seated in meditation, flanked by animals, crowned in horn, recurring like a dream no one recalls, but still wakes from. There are those who take the mystery further, who say the Indus people did not vanish, but transformed, that they became the ancestors of Dravidian cultures to the south, or migrated west across the Iranian plateau, carrying seeds and memory with them. Others claim their priesthoods dispersed, leaving behind fragments, techniques, rhythms, silent signs that no one ever fully read again. There are even fringe voices who wonder if their knowledge was older than it seemed, if the seals and stones preserve more than ritual, if they hid geometry, astronomy, a forgotten architecture of mind. But perhaps there is no resolution. Perhaps the Indus was not a beginning, nor an end, but something stranger, a shape in history that loops rather than marches forward, a lattice where meaning passed sideways rather than down, a form that leaves behind not lines, but shimmer. By the time the Mahajanapadas rose and the Vedic fires burned high, Harappa had long turned to clay. Its drains filled, its walls crumbled inward. And yet even then echoes were noticed. The way a settlement bent toward water, the careful layout of lanes, the silent reverence of stone platforms, facing nothing in particular. All these remnants spoke, quietly, without names. Not presence, but pattern. So many questions remain unanswered. Why was there no monument to decline? No sorrow in the stones? Was that refusal or design? Had they understood something we did not? That permanence was not in brick, but in rhythm? We cannot know. Their script remains silent, their gods unnamed, their voices unheard. But in the spaces they left, others built. In the patterns they traced, others followed, and in that shadowed continuity they remain, not in song, not in ruin, but in drift, in the dust at the threshold of what came next, not forgotten, but unfinished. Crete lies like a sleeping beast in the blue folds of the eastern Mediterranean, long and narrow, its spine a serrated ridge of mountains that catch the sun in silver streaks. To the north, the Aegean breathes in and out against its shores. To the south, the Libyan Sea murmurs old names to the wind. The island belongs to neither, and to both, a place between, a cradle lashed in salt and shadow. Here the light moves differently. It does not simply fall, it dances. It glints through olive groves and bleeds gold through clouds. It catches on the plastered walls of ancient dwellings and lingers on frescoes that haven't felt touch in 3,000 years. The sun here is not just heat, it is memory. A memory of brightness before the shadow. The Minoans were born into this light, shaped by it, and in turn, shaped the world that stood beneath it. No one can say exactly when they arrived. Perhaps from Anatolia, or Cyprus, or the Cyclades, perhaps from somewhere else entirely, from a past that left no map. They brought with them seeds and fire, goats and song. But Crete was not merely settled, it was awakened. Its caves became sanctuaries, its peaks were crowned with stone, rivers were watched, and trees were marked. There is a sacredness here that predates even worship. Before there were temples, there were thresholds. Before gods, there were signs in the rock and wind in the hills that spoke in languages now lost. And always, the sea. Around Crete, the sea is not boundary but breath. It curled close like a lover, and the people learned its moods with reverence. Fish shimmered in the markets, and sails stitched trade routes to far lands. But more than a highway, the sea was myth made liquid. It surrounded, protected, threatened, blessed. Storms rose like omens. Dolphins danced in the surf like messengers. The sea gave and took, and in it the Minoans saw their reflection, shifting, beautiful, ungraspable. Even the myths remember. It was here, they say, that the bull roamed the labyrinth, that Daedalus built his winding prison beneath the palace of Knossos, that Pasiphae bore the creature that was neither man nor beast, that Theseus came with his thread. These are not just stories. They are echoes of something older, stranger. The labyrinth may not have been a building, but a worldview, a pattern of spirals, a way of thinking that folded space and spirit inward. Knossos itself, sprawling and dreamlike, hints at this. Rooms leading to rooms, frescoes without end, stairways to nowhere. A palace or a riddle, or both. Before Linear A, before frescoes of dolphins and lilies, before the axe and the horn became sacred signs. There was this, the land, the sea, the light, and something awakening between them. A civilization was stirring, not with war but with rhythm, not with conquest but with dance. A people stepping into the open with bare feet and open hands, looking not to dominate but to dazzle. They did not build walls, they built invitations. And so it began, in the labyrinth of Crete, in the clarity of the light, in the echoing silence between waves. A song hummed by the earth itself. Not yet a name, not yet a kingdom, but the breath before the first word. They did not build to dominate, nor to dwell. They built to mark, to remember, to whisper something back to the world that gave them shape. In the earliest centuries of the Minoan rise, when kings were still a future invention and cities mere clusters of stone and soil, there were already places set aside from the rest, places where the breath of the island felt altered, where footfalls softened and the air grew dense with meaning, not with grandeur, but with presence. Shrines emerged on high ridges, nestled between cliffs and sky. Others took root in the low belly of caves, damp with mineral scent and distant drip, wombs of the earth still whispering heat from a more volcanic age. These were the first temples, and they bore no walls of power, no idols in gold. They were spaces carved gently into the fabric of the land, not to house gods, but to approach them. At the edge of plateaus, stone enclosures ringed in dry-laid masonry held the first ceremonies. Flat slabs worn smooth by countless kneelings. Pits of ash, bone and charcoal layered in memory. Offerings to something unseen, but never unfelt. The bodies that moved through these spaces did so with care, their gestures deliberate, their silences shared. Clay vessels painted in curling spirals held grains and oil. Small figurines of women with outstretched arms stood watch near niches of fire-blackened rock. Beeswax burned beside them, its sweetness mingling with smoke. Saffron-colored robes moved like threads in wind. And above, on the high crests, windbells made from pierced pottery chimed softly when the sea breath reached them. The sacred was not distant here. It did not live atop thrones or descend from thunder. It flowed through gesture and grain, through gesture and offering, as real as the taste of honey, as intimate as the kneeling knee. Even the tools used for ritual bore marks of everyday life. Pestles used to grind pigment, shell inlays from fishing nets repurposed for adornment. There was no line drawn between the sacred and the domestic. One bled into the other, until a hearth could feel like an altar, and an altar like a memory of home. Caves served as oracles, darknesses that blinked back with damp eyes. Some believed they were used to seek dreams. The air within held a different kind of time, slow, mineral, echoing with the breath of unseen water. These chambers were not sealed off. They were returned to again and again. On walls, the soot of ancient torches still clings. In crevices, offerings remain, shells, small bones, pieces of painted ceramic broken on purpose. Perhaps to release something, perhaps to feed something, perhaps only to be seen by the stone itself. And high above, on the ridgelines and peaks, where thin paths snake between rock and thorn, the mountain sanctuaries caught the sky. Shrines without roofs, basins cut into stone, terraces aligned to solstice and wind. From here, the island unrolled beneath the clouds, vineyards below, olive groves tracing the shoulders of hills, and the sea, always the sea, reaching in silence toward the horizon. At dawn, the sun painted every curve. At dusk, the cold came quickly, and the fire was kindled again. Here they brought offerings of bread, wine, animal bones, and perhaps most sacred, ritter carved in the shape of bulls' heads, from which liquid would flow like breath. The bull had no throne, but it was honored, its power not merely in muscle, but in motion, leaping, curving, turning, and in the temples below, deeper in the valleys, small stone platforms were placed not to hold weight, but to invite it. They were danced upon, jumped from, circled, and always there were watchers, not of the crowd, but of the act. Priestesses and youths, limbs dusted with pigment and ash, their bodies moving in rhythm older than speech. There are no texts to describe the rites, only fragments of frescoes and the remnants of music shaped into bone flutes and lyres of stretched sinew. This was not worship in the form of conquest or supplication. It was embodiment. To leap was to praise. To stir grain with a carved ladle was to summon memory. To place one's hand in the groove of an altar worn by hundreds before was to enter a lineage older than genealogy. It was not belief they held, but a kind of knowing. A rhythm passed down not through doctrine, but through hands and hips and breath. Even the walls of later palaces, though grander, still echoed these beginnings. Beneath the polished stones and painted corridors of Knossos and Phaistos, the memory of cave and mountaintop remained. Architectural echoes, light wells like the mouths of old sanctuaries, lustral basins shaped like the rock-cut basins above. The divine had not been caged, only translated, from peak to chamber, from fire circle to fresco, from bee-sweet offering to painted wall. We do not know their gods by name. No pantheon survives, no scripture remains. But they built in relation to wind and moon and flame. Their altars faced the east where day began. Their horns of consecration crowned the skyline. And always, above them, around them, the elements moved in harmony. Earth for grounding, sea for offering, fire for transformation, air for ascent. And so, the first temples did not demand. They invited. They did not hold the gods. They welcomed them, not in permanence, but in passing. As a breeze enters a room, curls around a shoulder, then drifts on. These were not monuments to be conquered or feared. They were places for remembering what the body already knew, that the sacred is not held in walls or words, but in movement, offering, and the stillness after flame. The city stirred with color. From open courtyards and terraced rooftops came a rhythm, footsteps on stone, sandals brushing clay, anklets chiming against bare ankles bronzed by the sun. It was a world woven by touch and ornament, where beauty was not reserved for temples, but spilled into the streets. Crimson-painted walls bore frescoes of dancers mid-leap, curls in motion, arms extended as if to keep time with the music that shimmered through the air. Women moved with authority, adorned in flounced skirts and braided hair scented with myrrh. Their waists were cinched with embossed belts, their shoulders bare beneath filigreed necklaces that caught the sun like molten thread. They bought saffron from stone jars. They traced symbols onto wax tablets. Some balanced baskets of olives against their hips. Others stamped linen with seals, not signatures of rule, but of craft, of trade, of ownership made by hand. Men, too, played their part, some with inked palms pressing letters into wet clay, others hammering copper sheets into blades shaped for ceremony, not war. Markets spilled with dyed wool and goat cheese, carved ivory and pomegranates split open like amulets. Sailors arrived with obsidian, left with amphorae of honeyed wine. This was no kingdom of walls, but of movement, of exchange, of a civic life that pulsed like drumbeat and tide. And then, the arena. Not for blood, but for balance. The bull leapers gathered barefoot before the charge, young bodies coiled in readiness, limbs wiry with training. A handler whispered low at the bull's ear while the crowd held its breath. Then motion, a rush of hooves against dust, the arc of flesh and muscle in flight. One grasped the horns, vaulted up, spun mid-air, landed behind the beast like a shadow made of grace. The spectacle was dance. The bull was sacred, never slain, never shamed. It was the partner in a ritual too old for speech, too alive to be called myth. On frescoed walls and painted jars, the leper's pose repeats, arms wide, back arched, legs caught in a perfect suspension, as though defying gravity were not defiance at all, but reverence. Symbols bloomed across the city, double axes carved into stone thresholds, lilies painted along stairwells, spiral curls etched beside wells where water caught sky. The language they spoke, linear A, was alive then, crisp on the tongue, etched into potsherds and ledgers. No cipher, no riddle, just a living script made for lists, for hymns, for orders sent by tablet and tied with twine. Festivals followed the moon, the harvest, the sea. Cymbals rang from terraces. Aromatic smoke curled from rooftop altars. Children darted beneath fabric canopies chasing painted balls. Perfume clung to silk sleeves. The city bloomed and rebloomed, not in cycles of power, but in pulses of celebration. No one watched from a throne. No generals marched beneath banners. What guided this world was not decree, but desire, to move, to make, to mark time in color and gesture, in feast and form. Even the sacred was sensuous. The goddess did not demand sacrifice, only presence. She lived in the curve of a dancer's spine, in the offering of grain at a doorway, in the flicker of gold at a wrist brushing past braided hair. And always, somewhere close, the bull, not as brute, not as beast, but as guardian of the dance, as emblem of a people who built not fortresses but frescoes. And in the warm air beneath cypress and fig, where lilies opened in window boxes and sandals whispered across polished stone, the city thrived in motion, in fragrance, in the shimmer of a world that never once stood still. Beneath the ash-grey dust of time, in storerooms and palace floors, they are still waiting, small, unassuming fragments of thought, pressed into wet clay by hands, long vanished, tablets the colour of dry bone, no larger than a palm, scored with careful strokes and curling signs. They do not shout, they do not explain, they whisper nothing, and yet they remain. The script we call Linear A, a script that speaks, but not to us. There are fewer than 2,000 such inscriptions. Most are brief. Some appear on storage jars, others beside ceremonial altars, others still in the darkened hollows of mountain sanctuaries. Each mark shaped with precision, neither hurried nor idle. Their lines arc like reeds bending in water, or rise in hooked curves, like scythes or lunar horns. Many repeat, a pattern, a rhythm, but meaning eludes us. Was this a ledger, a hymn, a warning? The signs offer form but not voice. The language behind the signs is lost. Not Greek, not Sumerian, not Indo-European. Some believe it was unique, the sound of a people whose tongue left no cousin behind. The symbols resemble those of commerce, inventories of oil, wool, spice. Yet others occur only in sacred contexts, found buried with offerings, sealed in caves, etched onto libation vessels and votive blades. The boundary between market and temple blurs. Perhaps it always did. The tablets tell us almost everything, and nothing. They tell us someone kept record, that someone wrote to remember, or perhaps to preserve. They tell us that the Minoans had something worth marking, and someone to mark it for, but they do not tell us why. No Rosetta Stone has ever emerged, no key, no cipher, no translation, only repetition and recurrence. Glyphs arranged like prayers folded and placed in a language only the gods understood. Were these words ever meant to be read again? Or were they part of the rite, the act of writing as ritual itself? Some scholars wonder if the script was used only by a priestly class, if literacy was sacred, secret, withheld. Others see in it a practical language, used to count grain and incense, wine and honey. There are no long narratives, no epics, no boasts, only fragments, names perhaps, totals, or something stranger, a grammar without a sentence. Some say the symbols are not words at all, but movements. That each glyph represents a gesture, a posture, a sequence in a sacred dance now forgotten. Others see a musical notation, the hum of rites that once echoed in sanctuaries carved above the sea. Still others suggest the script conceals a code so ancient that it predates writing itself. A memory system, a set of prompts for chants, or myths, or laws recited aloud beneath oil lamps in the still of evening. There are stranger theories still. Some claim the signs encode a star map, a calendar woven into syllables, tracing lunar rites and equinox prayers. Others speak of echoes from lost Atlantis, a survivor tongue from a civilization submerged by time. There are those who whisper of deliberate silence, that the script was buried, not forgotten, that its keepers chose absence, to hide what should not be spoken again. And perhaps that is the point. That mystery was part of the design, that what survives is not language, but veil, the veil itself, sacred, a boundary between those who wrote and those who merely look, like the masks worn in Minoan ritual, beautiful, human, but hiding something just beyond knowing. The clay has hardened, the fire has passed, but the shapes endure. You can see them still, lined in careful rows behind museum glass. A code that no one can break, a voice that still breathes, but does not speak. The script curls like a fossilized murmur, pressed by hands into earth, then fired by time. It is not that we lost their words. It is that we were never meant to carry them. What was said in the age of the goddess remains with her, not erased, not broken, only veiled. And sometimes a veil is not drawn to conceal, but to sanctify. It began far from Knossos, not with omen or warhorn, but with pressure, building silently in the caldera beneath what we now call Santorini, a chamber of molten breath, sealed in black stone, tightened with every passing season. For centuries, perhaps millennia, it gathered in the dark, unseen, unheard, until the day it could no longer hold. The earth convulsed. A rupture deep below the seabed tore upward with a force older than God's. What followed was not a singular roar, but a sequence, each blast more immense than the last. Columns of ash rose like pillars of smoke from a broken altar, reaching 10, 20, 30 kilometers into the sky. Lightning danced in the cloud's gut. The sun vanished behind a veil not of myth, but of volcanic glass. Ash rained for days. It fell on the sea like burnt snow, clogging waves and painting the surface grey. Islands disappeared beneath it. The air itself thickened, dry, bitter, sulphurous, a taste of the underworld rising through the lungs. Far from Thera, ships rocked in sudden, soundless swells. Animals fled inland. Water pulled from shores, dragging fish and coral and silence behind it. Then the wave came. Not a ripple, not a crest, but a wall. High as a palace, fast as memory. Some say it reached Crete in less than an hour. Others say the sea pulled back, paused, and returned in fury. The coastline crumpled, harbours vanished, ships snapped like reeds, fields salted in an instant. And where the foam surged, there were no dancers left, only stone and broken mast. We do not know what the Minoans saw. There are no chronicles, no carved lament. But something shifted in the wake. The trade routes to the Cyclades went quiet. The markets thinned. Palaces that once thrived began to age. Cracks in plaster. Mosaics darkened. Not from flame, but from neglect. As if the pulse of the world had skipped, and never quite returned to rhythm. The eruption of Thera was among the greatest geological events in human memory. Its blast may have been heard as far as Anatolia. Its ash settled in Greenland's ice. Some whisper that it birthed the legend of Atlantis, an island swallowed by sea and wrath, its memory refracted into myth. Others believe Knossos weathered the storm, spared the direct blow, but not the consequence. What needs no theory is this. In the aftermath, nothing was as it had been. In frescoes painted after the ashfall, the bulls still leap, the lilies still bloom, but their lines feel more hurried, less certain. The colors remain, ochre, cobalt, vermilion, but the hands that shaped them had seen too much sky gone black. Art clings to memory when language fails, and the Minoans painted beauty, even as the world cracked beneath them. Was this the beginning of the end, or merely the breath between verses? Some scholars say Thera shattered the fragile web of Minoan trade, that harbours once rich with tin, ivory, lapis, suddenly stood alone. Others argue the eruption was not the final blow, but the first tremor, that the real unravelling came later, by human hand or shifting sky. Still others insist Knossos survived for centuries more, diminished, yes, but still royal, still proud. The sea gave them life, fed their vines, carried their copper, reflected their gods. And in the end, it was the sea that changed its mind. No malice, no message, just tectonic inevitability, a fault line breathing. What ash buried was not only cities, it buried time, moments, words, names we were never meant to know. When fire meets water, the past turns to steam. The Minoans had no myths of endings that we know. But perhaps they whispered them. Perhaps a child stood on a hill above the waves and asked where the ships had gone. Perhaps a mother, pressing dye into cloth, watched the sky go strange and told no one what she feared. Perhaps they dreamed of fire beneath the sea and woke to find it real. The palace still stood, its courtyards intact, its columns upright, its storerooms dry. From a distance it might have seemed unchanged, but inside the air had thickened. The murals that once bloomed with colour now wore a pall of soot. Frescoes once alive with limbs in flight, dancers mid-arc, bulls mid-leap, had begun to crack, to peel, to quiet. The movement was no longer there, or if it was, it had settled into stillness, as if the figures had grown uncertain of their own dance. The rhythm faltered, not with a scream, but a stammer. A corridor once open to sea breeze was now blocked with stone. A room once used for music now stored jars of grain. The spaces remained, but their meanings had shifted, as though the palace had forgotten the choreography it was built to contain. Foreign shapes began to appear in the corners, handles forged in a different mould, pottery with rigid lines, harsh and uncurved, and elsewhere marks, scratched into tablets, pressed into damp clay. Linear B. A script that carried commands, tallies, rosters. It spoke not of myths, but of measurements, not of serpents or lilies, but of rations and taxes. And those who held the styluses did not wear flowing linen. Stranger still were the blades, bronze cast in forms unfamiliar, heavier, sharp-edged, found beside bodies buried in ways the island did not remember, not curled in rest, but straight, not beneath the open sky, but sealed in stone. Some say these were Mycenaeans, a new people from across the wine-dark sea. Others whisper of division within, a shifting of gods, a fracturing of faith. But nothing is certain, only that something entered, or rose, or broke. The bull, once painted across every wall, had begun to vanish. Where it remained, it seemed out of place, an echo of another time, its eyes clouded by the ash. In its place came other forms, helmets, spears, blocky chairs on platforms, not thrones, precisely, but emblems of control. The open courtyards were enclosed, the colonnades narrowed, the palace turned inward, and yet no conquest is recorded, no epic carved in stone, no names preserved of kings or victors, only hints, layers of rebuilding, burned timber beneath fresh floors, walls rebuilt in haste with stones reused, rooms repurposed, hierarchies rearranged. Something deeper shifted. The body of the civilization remained, but the soul dimmed. The grace that once moved through it, the sense of breath held in beauty, of meaning layered in dance and offering, had receded. In its place came weight, ledger, command, order without rhythm. There are tablets that list tribute, sacks of wheat, jars of oil, heads of sheep, but no mention of the festivals that once wrapped the city in color, no record of the hymns sung to the mountains or the rituals whispered in caves. The gestures were not written down, and the ones who remembered them may have already departed. Some believe there was war, others a religious shift. Perhaps the gods were no longer listening, or perhaps they had changed their names. Whatever it was, it moved through the island slowly, but with certainty. A smudging of the once crisp line between art and account, grace and governance, sea wind and stone. It is tempting to call this an ending, but it is not quite that. The palace lived on, for a time. Its chambers echoed with new voices. Its walls bore new shapes, but something essential had folded inward. The dancer had stilled. The music had faded, though no one had struck the drum. And above it all the mountain watched. The same ridges, the same horizon, the same sea, but colder now. Less a cradle than a mirror, reflecting not what had been, but what had changed. A palace still stood. But the king, if there ever was one, did not return. Only the stone remained, and the shadow of a rhythm no longer played. Long after the palaces had crumbled, and the columns lay scattered like fallen reeds, something lingered in the stones of Crete. Not just the shape of what had been, but the memory of a rhythm that no longer beat. The island did not fall silent all at once. It faded, like a fresco worn down by centuries of salt and sun. What had once been bold, crimson, gold, obsidian black, now flickered like breath upon plaster. The outline remained, but the music had left the room, and yet echoes endure. A horned figure in myth, a dance around a pillar, a name half remembered, something ancient, misremembered as dream. What survived was not a lineage, nor a language, but a feeling, the trace of grace, delicate and inexplicable. Greece rose from Crete's bones, but the shape of its inheritance was crooked, like a reflection seen in broken water, a story told second-hand. There were goddesses, yes, but veiled now. Bulls, yes, but penned and violent. The labyrinth remained, but now it held a monster. What the Greeks could not explain, they turned into legend. Daedalus and Icarus, Pasiphae and her curse, the Minotaur, born of shadow and desire. Perhaps it was not fear that shaped the myth, but awe. Perhaps the real terror was not the beast in the maze, but the brilliance of a people who needed no kings, no war, no great conquest to define them. A people who carved beauty into vessels and danced with beasts. A people who slipped away, not with flame, but with a bow. Some look to Atlantis and see Crete, an echo in Plato's parable. A civilization advanced, strange, swallowed by the sea. The timing is close, the geography persuasive. But Atlantis is a mirror. It reflects what the seer wishes to see, and the Minoans are harder to hold. They do not shout across time, they hum. No golden tridents or ruined utopias, just a thread of questions, and the curve of a bull's horn buried in the earth. Archaeologists count ruins, historians mark dates, but beneath both is a truth less measurable, the ache of something elegant lost. Minoan walls do not proclaim, they invite. Their frescoes are not victories, they are moments. Girls in saffron skirts, boys mid-air over a bull's back, flowers blooming on walls, a civilization that painted not its wars, but its wonders, and that, perhaps, is why it passed into myth. The world remembers fire, but it struggles to remember joy. There is no inscription that tells us why they vanished, no epic poem, no funerary lament, just the dust of Knossos, the buried rings of Phaistos, and fragments of clay that once carried messages no one now can read. Some say the Mycenaeans absorbed them, others say the priesthoods fractured, that the Thera eruption broke more than stone, it broke belief, that when the old gods ceased to speak, the dancers forgot the steps, and still, beneath the layered stone of time, the echo persists, not loud, not even clear, but present, like the softest drum beneath the skin. Every so often a scholar leans too close to a seal and hears a whisper. A myth carries a scent of saffron, a ruin bends the light just so, and for a moment the maze is open again, not to be solved, but to be walked. What remains of the Minoans is not a monument, it is a question, one that curves and coils and resists straight answers. Were they a matriarchy, a theocracy, a civilization that gave birth to Europe's soul? Or something altogether different, a dream we keep misinterpreting because it does not wish to be explained? Perhaps they never vanished at all. Perhaps they transformed into symbol, into metaphor, into a deeper rhythm within the human story. Not lost, but buried as seeds are. High in the broken spine of Anatolia, where rock splits sky and the wind howls like an animal left behind, the first stirrings of another kingdom took root, not in the softness of river valleys, but in the harsh embrace of stone. There was no sea here to cradle them, no vast plain for easy farming, only cliffs, ravines, hidden springs, and the slow labor of the land itself. The earth was tough, coiled with iron beneath its crust, and so too were the people. They built with what the mountains gave them, dark stone, heavy timber, the bone of the land. Their cities rose not to defy the earth, but to anchor themselves within it. Hattusa, Nerik, Sapinua, names like chipped teeth, dug deep into the ridges. This was not a land of gods born in sun. It was a land of storms, and it bowed to the thunder. The early Hittite kings bore titles as heavy as the walls they built: Labana, Hattusili, names carved into tablets with the force of thunderclaps. Their lineage was not a tale of inheritance but conquest, loose tribes drawn together, vassals tamed by oath and blade. And over it all hung the will of Tarhunt, the storm god, the rider of clouds. He did not smile from above, he roared. His voice was in the lightning that split trees, his approval, measured in rain or drought. When a king rose, it was not by blood alone, but by pact with power older than the written word. Even now the bones of their first great city remain. Hattusa, cold and windswept, ringed by 6 massive gates: Lion Gate, King's Gate, Sphinx Gate, each one a guardian, each one a threshold, built only for endurance before grandeur. within its walls, storehouses, temples, royal residences. Beneath it, tunnels and vaults like the veins of a great beast. Stone tablets lay stacked in archives, thousands, as if the empire knew it would be questioned and prepared its answers in advance. They did not begin as conquerors. They began as listeners, to sky, to omen, to rockfall. Theirs was a logic shaped by storms, hard to predict, harder still to ignore. And so they moved with careful force, alliances woven, then broken, cities absorbed, languages adopted, enemies studied. The Hittites left little to chance, and much to interpretation. Their rise was slow, a century of footholds, then a burst, a push outward, across mountains, toward the rivers of Syria, the gates of Babylon. And yet, for all their expansion, they never unlearned their homeland. Hattusa remained their core, their cold heart. A place not lush, but lasting. Even their gods wore boots caked in mountain dust. Theirs was not a palace dream. It was a fortress memory. And the storms remained. Not just in sky, but in law, in war, in the temper of their kings. The Hittites learned early that nothing is permanent, not peace, not loyalty, not even lineage. Kings were deposed, brothers turned to rivals. Succession came with blood, not always blessing, but the walls stood. The gates remained sealed, and the sky, ever their judge, watched. Before the treaties, before the battles at Kadesh, before the letters to pharaohs and vassals, there was this, a kingdom born of stone and storm, one that rose not in the shade of gods, but in the full violence of their weather. The world would come to fear their chariots, their scribes, their kings, who wore the weight of empire like armor. But that was later. Here, in the beginning, there was only thunder, and a people who dared to answer it. The Hittites governed in layers, not merely by crown or conquest, but by the slow, deliberate movement of stylus across clay. In the vaulted chambers of Hattusa, where the light fell not in shafts but in slits, scribes hunched over damp tablets, fingers marked by pressure and pigment, wrists stiff with precision. These were not merely records, they were decisions made permanent, intentions dried into permanence. The empire remembered not through marble or monument, but by texture and impression. Each tablet bore the faint ridges of a human hand, a palm's weight translating thought into permanence. The king issued laws, the tablet held them, and what was written endured. Over 30,000 tablets slept within the Hittite archive, a library of earth and intent. There were contracts etched in urgency, accounts layered with grain tallies and chariot counts, ceremonial oaths woven with ritual clarity. There were prayers, yes, but also marriage agreements, water rights, maps of roads that crossed rivers and tributaries alike. These were not poetic verses meant to endure by beauty. They endured because they were needed. Bureaucracy was the empire's breath, slow, rhythmic, unglamorous. But it moved across centuries with a kind of choreography, a dance of sealed cylinders, scrawled names, marked approvals, and scripts copied by hand, again and again, across generations. There was power in repetition. There was control in the clay. The Hittite king was no distant oracle. He wrote. He read. In chambers cooled by carved stone and soot-stained air, monarchs corrected scribes, issued addenda, edited phrasing. Royal decrees carried not just the voice of the sovereign, but his hand. Among the shelves were treaties with faraway lands, none more famous than that with Egypt, etched in Akkadian, the language of diplomacy. Signed with symbols of eternal peace after the clash at Kadesh, it reads not as surrender or submission, but as structured balance. Bound by clause and counterclause, it is not poetry. It is promise, rendered in wedge-shaped precision, and within its dry logic hums the heartbeat of a world where war could end with ink. They named themselves in seals, personal cylinders pressed into clay like signatures folded in time. These seals, some no larger than a fingertip, bore not the flourish of ego, but the structure of hierarchy. Each one marked a rank, a title, a place in the living bureaucracy. Some were passed down. Some were shattered when broken trust dissolved authority. The seal was not a decoration. It was identity, hardened in script and fired by duty. In this world, who you were depended not on ancestry alone, but on what impression you left behind. And in this empire of scribes, nothing vanished quietly. Even a complaint about livestock, if recorded, was preserved. A broken wheel, a delayed shipment of barley, the marriage of a merchant's daughter, these found their place in the same archive as royal commands. The difference between palace and pasture was only a matter of script. The clay treated all equally once marked, and so the Hittites ruled not by awe or splendor, but by legibility. They mastered a world through forms, and those forms became their walls, their bridges, their pulse. When later kingdoms tried to find them, it was the tablets that spoke first. Before their gods, before their warriors, there was their handwriting, and in it, the empire lived again, not in flame, not in legend, but in the curl of a character, in the angle of a line. The language of empire was not shouted, it was inscribed. There were no idols behind glass in the high places of Hatti, no gentle-eyed shepherd gods, no polished thrones of gold. The gods of the Hittites walked in the roar of tempests and the whisper of rising mist. They were not seen. They were sensed. In the charged hush before rain, in the tremble of smoke above the altar, in the stifled dreams of kings. These were not beings of parable or parlour. They were forces housed in form, wild and sovereign. The weather god of Hatti did not merely preside. He ruled the pulse of the sky. His breath was dry thunder, his gaze a shimmer on bronze shields left outside the temple walls. Beneath him, not worship, submission, not hymns, pacts. Temples clung to the bones of mountains, not to be beautiful, but to be heard. Their windows faced no one direction, and their altars bore no single god. A dozen deities might dwell in a single room, local, borrowed, ancestral, foreign, each with a name inked on clay, each with a feast, each with a need. Some gods arrived from conquered cities, taken not as trophies but as wards. Others slipped in from the south, the Levantine coast, riding on merchant tongues. The pantheon grew not like a tree but like a storm, branches tangled, flashes unpredictable. In Hattusa, even the wind was crowded with divinity. The kings knew they did not rule alone. Their power was not absolute, it was contracted. They took oaths not merely with men, but with the skies. These were not metaphors. Oaths in Hittite ritual were written into the very stones of the empire, scratched into boundary markers, inked into diplomatic clay, breathed into fire. A broken promise did not result in shame. It summoned famine, illness, collapse. Sacrifice was not a gesture of reverence. It was punctuation. It sealed the divine ear to the speaker's words. The cut of the blade, the fall of the blood. These were not symbolic. They were signatures. In the chambered dark of the rock-cut sanctuaries, priests moved like memory, slow, robed, bearing bowls of grain and coals. Statues stared with blank eyes. Their mouths did not move. Still, prayers were answered, or so it was believed, in wind-churned dreams and in the trembling of reeds. When kings lay ill, the gods were asked not to heal, but to permit the healing. The difference was not lost on anyone. Across the empire, tablets were kept listing symptoms and the rites to cure them. Diseases were not random. They were reprimands. Guilt carried weight. So did ritual. The gods, after all, could be bargained with, but not deceived. Even the sun was not benevolent. The sun goddess of Arina was warm, yes, but watchful. She saw not just the fields and the roads, but the thoughts of her servants. In her light, lies wilted. Hittite scribes wrote of her gaze in terms of record-keeping, a divine archivist, sealing truth into the folds of fate. If a king rose by fraud, she saw. If a vow was broken, she marked it. Her presence was not comfort, but compliance. Rituals in her honor involved not only incense and chant, but exactitude, measured steps, precise intonations, the correct day on the correct tablet, under the correct sky. The gods of Hatti did not love as mortals love. They did not reward with affection. They demanded order. The weather god brought rain, but asked for cattle. The grain goddess gave harvest, but needed purity. When the terms were unclear, or when disaster struck despite obedience, the people turned to diviners. Dreams were passed like contracts, omens weighed like coins. Even the pattern of smoke from a burnt offering could confirm a treaty, or doom it. In this way, theology bled into governance. The gods did not stand above the king. They stood beside him, within him, around him. To break a treaty was to offend a god. To lose a war was not misfortune. It was judgment. And still, in all their fire and shadow, the gods of the Hittites had no single face. The same storm deity might bear 4 names in 4 valleys. One sun might warm the fields of Hattusa, another the riverbanks near Carchemish. Some gods held dual natures, both male and female, both hunter and guardian. Others were nothing but names on tablets, invoked during plagues or harvests, and then forgotten. Religion here was not codified. It was accumulated. Each ritual a layer, each oath a thread. The pantheon was less a structure than a breathing thing, veined and branching, stitched into the very grain of rule. In the end, perhaps that was the truest expression of the divine for the Hittites, not flame or thunder or sunlight, but memory. A memory carried in bone, in clay, in blood, a presence without beginning, without end, only terms. And should the gods go silent, it was not absence, it was waiting. The Hittite Empire did not sprawl across deserts or cling to harbors. It lived inward, in ridges and ravines, on high plateaus scoured by sun and frost. The sea, so often a cradle to other empires, was distant here. But from that very distance, something remarkable emerged. A kingdom held not by tide or trade winds, but by the logic of roads, the rhythm of wheels, and the invisible grip of systems. Stone roads, worn smooth by centuries of hooves and axles, reached across the plateau like tendons, taut, durable, unseen from afar, yet essential. Along them moved chariots and carts, tribute and grain, soldiers and scribes. These were not ornamental paths. They were arteries, pulsing not with blood, but with tax records, dispatches, ore, and law. Hittite engineers measured with cords, surveyed with care, and laid their routes not for glory, but for efficiency. Even the wheel was regulated, spoke counts, axle lengths, the width of the rut itself. It was a government of gradients. The chariot, more than weapon, less than legend. Light, fast, deadly on open ground. Hittite designs differed from their rivals. Broader axles, sturdier builds, designed for long campaigns across rough inland terrain. This was not the chariot of parades, but of grit and pragmatism. Its wheels turned not just toward conquest, but toward deterrence. It arrived as signal, not just sword. And the empire maintained entire workshops, craftsmen who shaped spokes and bronze fittings with care, day after day. Power here was standardized, repeatable, the metallurgy of command. In mountain forges and village kilns, something began to change. The flicker of a different fire, not gold, not silver, not even bronze, but something darker, harder and new. Iron, not yet mastered, not yet refined, but present, like an idea forming in the heat. Was it the Hittites who first drew the blade from black ore? Some say yes, others argue, but the evidence is there. Tools, arrowheads, ceremonial daggers, not forged in wealth, but in experiment. Iron, born not of ritual, but of pressure, of the need to endure. The empire did not yet fall into the Iron Age, but it leaned toward it, like a wheel just beginning to shift direction. This was an empire of thresholds, but not the kind carved in stone. These were thresholds of grain, of loyalty, of metal and memory. The vassal kingdoms were many, some close by, others far-flung and fractious, yet all were bound by sealed agreements, intermarriages, tribute systems. A prince might be sent to Hattusa for education. A daughter might be wed to a Hittite cousin. The bonds were not always strong, but they were many. And each tether, a string in the web that held the empire upright. When one trembled, others absorbed the strain. Even messengers were a system unto themselves. Way stations kept stocked with water and oatcakes. Horses traded out like clockwork. Each scroll sealed, carried, received, acknowledged. Time moved in weeks, not whims. Administration functioned not through the force of one man's voice, but through the hum of routines. Orders did not gallop on impulse. They followed channels. A kind of governmental hydraulics. The great strength of the Hittites was never flamboyant. It was measured. It moved underground, along ridges, across bridges, and through iron-laced soil. It did not announce itself. It held. In winters, in sieges, in border conflicts, the systems endured longer than passion. When gods were silent and kings uncertain, roads still bore their weight. The empire, for all its myths and might, was built to last not because of fire, but because of form. And in that form lay its deepest secret, the machinery behind the myth. Not the roar of battle, nor the whispers of priests, but the slow grinding discipline of structure. The empire of the Hittites was never only about the crown. It was about what held the crown aloft, and how long that scaffolding could withstand the weight of history. The palace echoed with footsteps, measured, guarded, sometimes too soft to trace. In the courts of the Hittite high kings, nothing was said unless it had been weighed. Behind each word stood lineage. Behind each glance, a ledger. A crown in this realm was not born. It was engineered, passed down like a weapon sharpened at both ends. Fathers begat sons, but so too did ministers begat secrets. And sometimes kingship changed hands not by right, but by arrangement. The house of Hattusa wore its bloodline like a cloak stitched with daggers. One wrong movement and it slit its own spine. There were kings who ruled for decades, and kings whose reigns could be measured in storms. A son crowned by the will of the gods could find himself dethroned by the will of a cousin. Brothers turned cold, Uncles vanished. There were rituals for coronation, and there were rituals for burial, but often they were the same, one immediately after the other. It is told that kings who ascended too soon often went missing in the records, their names struck from tablets, their images left half-carved. Succession was not a ceremony. It was an equation with too many variables and too many hands writing answers. Some wore the crown but never the throne. Others held the throne but never the people's breath. The royal court was a stage with too many actors, and only one mask that truly fit, and all wished to wear it. In the deep halls of the capital, scribes copied the lineage of kings in script so fine they could fracture. One smudge, one blot, and a dynasty might disappear. Sons of concubines, sons of queens, sons adopted for convenience. They walked the same stone floors, each with a different ghost behind them. Blood was traced not by affection, but by annotation. A prince was as dangerous to his brother as a war was to the kingdom, and often far more silent. What remains today of Hittite rule are names chiseled into clay, sometimes overwritten, sometimes erased, royal seals shattered mid-sentence, successions that skip a generation like a heartbeat, held too long. The mask of the king, that finely worked gold with slitted eyes and no mouth, may have been worn by many, but it fit only a few. And of those few, fewer still survive their own story. One king may be remembered for his wars, another for his treaties, but more still are remembered only by what followed them: chaos, usurpation, fire. It is as if the very title of king was a burden too heavy for any one body to bear for long, as if the line itself was cursed not by gods, but by memory. The throne did not weep when kings fell. It simply waited for the next set of footsteps, careful and slow, to step into the blood that had barely dried. And so, the Hittite royal legacy is not told through peace or glory, but through fracture. A kingdom that could stretch across mountains could not always stretch across two brothers. The ink of rule was never dry. It bled. And in that blood, many claimed divinity, but few found rest. When a courier vanished on the high road, a granary remained unopened too long. A conscript sent south never returned, and no one sent word why. Horses flinched at the scent of wind, and elders began to mutter that the rains came late, or too often. There were no invaders at the gates, not yet. But those who kept the ledgers began to notice that fewer names returned from patrol, and fewer still were replaced. The capital whispered of bad omens, a lamb born with two heads, lightning striking dry stone, birds gathering in circles above a roof that never caught fire. Priests cast bones and called for silence. Traders said ships had vanished west of Cyprus. No one agreed on what was lost, but the letters slowed. The festivals shrank. A scribe's hand slipped. A seal cracked in storage. None of these were signs, until they were. Some claimed a fleet had been seen, far off the southern coast, hulls without colours, sails like teeth. Others spoke of fields that would not ripen, or soldiers gone thin in the hill posts. One vassal king begged for grain, then vanished from his own hall before the wagons arrived. The northern roads grew too quiet. A forge was found cold, its tools unlifted. There were rumours of desertions, but no rebels to name. There were rumours of plague, but no ashes in the street. There were rumours of rebellion, but no new banners raised. 1,000 explanations, and none complete. A tablet found near the lower storerooms bore only this line: "The gates are open, but none have entered." Another, half-charred, ended mid-sentence, as if the hand that shaped it was interrupted, not by death, but doubt. In one corner of the city, a barracks was found empty, its hearth still warm. In another, the temple scribes locked their archive doors from within, and did not answer when called. The empire did not shatter, it separated. Threads that once tugged taut between provinces loosened into air. A merchant crossed the border and found no guards. A messenger rode 5 days without sign of patrol. The royal court shifted south, then west, then again, always ahead of something they would not name. The chariot wheels creaked without roads to follow. The king's table remained set, though no orders were sent. In the streets of Hattusa, voices lowered, then ceased. Not out of fear, but from waiting too long. None knew who had come, or if anyone had, but something had changed. Columns cracked without wind, fires burned slow without kindling. At dawn the eastern gate hung open, no guards, no wreckage, just open, like a breath held too long, or a word never spoken. The stone lions at the gate watched, and did nothing. The scribes would later call it a dusk without horizon. The final day no different from the one before, except quieter, except thinner. Not an end, but the refusal of beginning. And so they did not carve a final word. No inscription marks the last king. No seal confirms the last dispatch. There is no record of the last prayer, no name of the last city to fall. What was written, burned. What was planned, buried. What was feared, arrived too quietly to wake the gods. We are left with the outline of an empire erased, a geography of absence. Once there were halls of order, where clay tablets mapped debts and alliances, births and curses. Now there are only craters where granaries stood, walls where letters never reached. The hands that once pressed stylus to wet clay are gone, and the clay has hardened into silence. Some speak of ships, strangers from the sea with weapons not of iron but of urgency. Others speak of rot from within, a failure not of armies, but of harvests, not of invasion, but of exhaustion, perhaps both, or neither. There are letters from allies unanswered, markets that went quiet before the flames ever reached their gates, smoke without signal, collapse without conquest. The empire ended, not with siege or scream, but with a mission. Cities vanish from correspondence, roads lose their names, vassals stop sending tribute, or perhaps there is simply no one left to receive it. Treaties once so carefully pressed into permanence dissolve, not with betrayal, but with forgetting. And yet something remains. A stamp buried in the dust, a tunnel that still holds the curve of its stone, a fragment of law too worn to read, the echo of names in foreign tongues, Hatti, Hattusa, spoken by those who never knew the rhythm of its breath. They left behind no last monument, no message to the world that came after. Only what they had always left, fragments, orderings, signs. But this time, no one remembered how to read them. There is power in what was lost, but also in how it was lost, not stolen, not shattered, only unmade, unnamed, unclaimed. A civilization that once wrote the laws of empires, now held only in the margins of other men's stories. So we remember them not through what they said, but through the silence they left behind, a silence shaped like an empire, a breath never drawn again, a name no longer spoken. We have walked tonight through cities that no longer call out, through streets planned with purpose, but emptied without explanation, through temples once bright with colour, now bare, through palaces that ruled with law, but left no farewell. The Indus, the Minoans, the Hittites, 3 peoples separated by land and sea, by language and ritual, and yet each meeting the same quiet fate, a fading, a vanishing, a silence so complete that even the names they gave themselves have been lost. What caused them to fall? We cannot say with certainty, not truly. Some speak of changing rivers, of failing rains. Others point to earthquakes, to famine, to the slow erosion of trade and faith. Some name invaders, raiders from the sea whose origins are unknown, and whose presence is only felt in the ash and broken stone they left behind. There are tales of drought, of plague, of civil unrest. And there are others still, who look to the sky, who speak of fires that fell, of cosmic violence, of things never written down but remembered in dreams. Perhaps some of it is true. Perhaps all of it is. Perhaps none. But one thing remains certain. They did not remain. Their cities did not endure. Their languages were not passed on. Their gods were left without worship. And whatever rhythms once guided their days, be it law or ritual or music, they came in time to an end. Not all history is written in ink. Some of it is silence. Some of it is absence. Some of it is the shape of a potsherd in the dust, or the outline of a vanished wall in the foundation of a modern city. And though we can study and wonder and trace patterns in the ruins, there are some things the past will not give back. To ask why so many great civilizations fell, all within a single age, is to open a question larger than any one people. But that story, that mystery, is for another night. Tonight we leave them here, in the earth, in the sea, in the stone. Not gone, but no longer present. Not forgotten, only quiet. And perhaps, dear listener, you feel it now, that hush, that subtle weight of vanished time. If you are still with us, thank you, truly, for walking these forgotten paths with care. In a world of headlines and hurry, you chose to drift through vanished ports and emptied capitals, to listen for what the stones no longer say, to imagine what was once felt and believed in places that now lie still. These civilizations are not just puzzle pieces in a lost age. They are reminders of how much can rise and how quietly it can fade. So let us part softly. Let the oil lamps gutter low. Let the temples sleep beneath their soil. The names, if they had them, are gone now. But the echoes remain, in riverbeds that forgot their course, in frescoes half remembered by salt and wind, in the cracked clay of unread languages. Sleep well tonight, and may your dreams drift past the edges of the known, into cities lit by firelight, shaped by grace, and veiled forever by silence.